Mr. Luthuli, Dr. Albertina Luthuli, and the Luthuli family, members of council, esteemed guests, dear South Africans, thank you for the opportunity to deliver the 2020 Chief Albert Luthuli Memorial Lecture in this momentous year, where we are celebrating the 25 years of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action. It is also during the 25 days of activism to end violence against women. I would like to pay my respects to Chief Albert Luthuli and to Umama Nogukanya. Both of them were leaders. We salute both of them and appreciate deeply the contribution and the sacrifices they made for our country and for our liberation. We are thankful for his ANC presidency and his contribution to the foundation of our democracy in both character and substance. Our constitution, I would argue, reflects the values of Chief Albert Luthuli. His values shine through in our constitution, and in that way, his legacy lives on in our constitution. Distinguished guests, the theme for today's lecture is the 1995 Conference on Women, where to South Africa and the rest of the continent. Let me begin by reflecting on South Africa's participation in Beijing 25 years ago. South Africa had a strong and a formidable delegation. Remember, it was in 1995. Our delegation was led by Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma. We were fresh coming from our 1994 democratic elections, and we were idealistic, we were determined, and we were eager to contribute to the global discourse on gender equality, as well as to engage in changes that will change our circumstances in our own country. In Beijing itself, African women stood strong. They were together, they were organized. They influenced the 12 critical areas that were adopted in Beijing. Since then, we have seen some changes and progress in the implementation of these areas. Nevertheless, change that has been significant and yet brittle, uneven, and also reversible, but nevertheless, change that has mattered. Gender equality is a public good, not a project for NGOs who have shouldered much of the responsibility in many countries. It affects more than half of humanity. It has an intergenerational impact. Gender equality determines the level of development as well as the type of development any country will undergo. And therefore, it cannot be achieved without significant involvement of government. The progress that we have seen happen as a result of the Beijing Declaration in many countries has been influenced by this combination of government determination and activism of citizens. The greatest progress took place in countries where women also have been able to work collaboratively with government. And we have seen governments, therefore, investing significantly in the implementation of the Beijing platform. For example, Most poor countries, especially on our continent, invested in girls' education and health. And this made sure that there was significant enrollment of girls, especially at primary school level. They invested also in women's health, and they managed to decrease maternal health. Globally, maternal health decreased by 38% by 2019. Governments also created institutions and mechanisms such as women's ministries, women's commissions. You will remember, distinguished guests, that before Beijing, we did not have those kinds of institutions. These were institutions that were meant to push forward gender equality, albeit very poorly funded. In South Africa, we did all of what I have referred to: girls' education, health, and establishing institutions. Many countries also changed their legislation and passed new legislation that promoted gender equality. They also changed constitutions to make sure that they were in line with the promotion of gender equality. In South Africa, as far as the legal framework was concerned, we were in better shape because of our constitution and the redeeming legislations that were passed in the first parliament, which was addressing different discrimination that we had inherited. To date in the world, 131 countries have participated actively in changing their laws, and 35 countries have amended their constitution so that they are in line with the promotion of gender equality. The changes have affected more than 2 billion girls and women in the world. The laws that have been changed are laws that have to do with especially violence against women, FGM, the age of marriage, which were laws to stop child marriage, citizenship, custody, property ownership, and much more. And many of these areas, as you know, distinguished guests, are life-changing. However, still more than 1 billion women in the world, as we speak, still live in jurisdiction where some of their rights are not protected in law. In some countries, as high as 75% of the rights of women are not protected in law. So this work continues, and in fact, it is the work that occupies my office much more in every part of the world, and especially in Africa. Where we have customary law and religious law, the work is much harder. In South Africa, we are therefore not in the worst positions, but we have remnants of customary laws that we need to pay attention to. For instance, we have to decisively address the concept and the practice of ukutwala, which is blatant abuse to girl children. We have also seen positive, at the same time discouraging changes in women's participation in leadership, which was on top of the agenda in Beijing. While most countries and political parties, like in South Africa, have promoted women's leadership, in some cases, in different countries, it has been the electorate that has reversed the gains. We, however, have witnessed sustained progress in countries where there are temporary measures such as targets and quotas. In South Africa, the determination by the ruling party for inclusion of women has been important to sustain participation of women in public office. Data tells us that the global average of representation of women in parliaments is only 25%. This means that in the world, all the laws that govern us are made by 75% of men. The number of women in leadership position, both in the public and private sector, is squeezed into a corner of 25%. This number clearly shows that we have work to do in order to attain parity, which is 25%. Women in boards on global average are only 25%. Most countries have also underperformed in the economic development of women. In general, economies are not structured to assist gender equality, even when they have passed laws to support women economically. The structure of the economy tends to work against women. For example, equal pay. In many countries, we have the laws that are promoting equal pay, but there are no mechanism to influence the implementation of these laws. Women are put down by the glass ceiling and the burden of care at home, which keeps women out of the labor market and compromises their sustained development and upward mobility in the workplace. It makes motherhood a penalty, while it gives rewards to fatherhood, as the ILO would present it. This is one of the most significant areas that has to change in order to facilitate gender equality. The unpaid care crisis has also been exposed by the COVID-19 pandemic that we currently face. So has the problem of violence against women in South Africa and all over the world. Women have engaged in the fight against gender-based violence, but we have not been able to see the desired results. Governments and community religious bodies have also taken on the fight. As of September 2020, 155 countries have passed laws against domestic violence. 140 countries passed laws against sexual harassment in the workplace. But effective implementation and allocation of resources required to end gender-based violence and for gender-based violence to be made histories have fallen short. In this area, change is desperately needed, including in our country. We have learned about the importance of targeted interventions in the past 25 years, and I've made the example of education and health, where some change were experienced because the interventions were targeted. We stopped everything when the world faced the corona pandemic. That is targeted intervention. All hands have been on deck in the world to fight this pandemic. We now know that when countries are determined to fight a pandemic and any enemy in their own shores, they can do it. We want to see equivalent determination in the fight to end violence against women. Countries closed borders. Countries made people to stay at home for their safeties. Frontline workers were deployed and they have worked selflessly 24 hours of the day. We need to see frontline workers for ending gender-based violence everywhere in the world, working just as hard. Distinguished guests, this pandemic threatens to erode modest gains that have been made since Beijing. One thing that we have learned from the past pandemics is that there is no gender-neutral pandemic. During the COVID-19 pandemic, as I've said, we have seen the escalation of violence, which we have called the shadow pandemic, as well as the burden of care. During lockdowns, when schools were closed, and at the height of the lockdown, 106 billion learners were out of schools. In this context, we have seen also the importance of digital infrastructure everywhere. And there is a gender digital gap which needs to be closed. But we have to provide digital infrastructure for children everywhere in the world. When children are at home, also the burden of care increase because it is women and girls who will look after other children, after sick people, and of course, also after old people. I want to emphasize this issue of unpaid care. It is estimated to cost currently in the United States an amount of up to 67 billion US dollars and will hit 147 billion dollars by 2050. In South Africa, unpaid care is estimated to be 26% of the economy, estimated to be 600 billion rands. These are values that are important because it means that women are shock absorbers of underperformance in the provision of infrastructure that should assist women to cope with care. South Africa, just with dealing with the child care infrastructure backlog, would create jobs and would enhance the quality of education for girls. It requires a solution. Excuse me. I understand you cannot see me.
We can see you. We can see you, Undersecretary.
Okay. Thanks. Okay, well, I got a message that you can't see me. Okay, sorry. Let me start again, or rather, let me end on the issue of unpaid care, which is important to address and can be addressed and has benefits. Now, let me talk about education, which is one of the areas where we have seen progress in the last 25 years, including in South Africa. If we cannot provide digital infrastructure, this one area of progress from the Beijing Declaration would also be undermined. We therefore call for the involvement of everybody who can to address the digital infrastructure, especially in communities where it does not exist. Economic restructuring, which has also been highlighted and exposed, the need for economic restructuring, which has also been highlighted by the inadequacy of access to economic benefits in the corona pandemic, has shown us that women still remains the most affected demographic by poverty. Coronavirus unemployment has impacted on women significantly. Women in the informal sector, women in the service sector, women in the tourism sector. We therefore need to address this. This is indeed one of the areas in the Beijing Declaration that was highlighted. We need to build back better, and building back better also means that we address and change our economic policy so that it enables the benefits for women that are significant and meaningful. This is a conversation that is needed globally. It is needed in South Africa to define what does building back better mean. We have been talking in different countries about building back better. We need a social contract that will ensure that we rebuild in a manner that will make sure that we are better than before the pandemic. Let me go back to Chief Luthuli and say that his presidency had many important qualities that are needed at this time. During his tenure, the ANC mounted a defiance campaign and fought and mobilized people from all walks of life in an inclusive way. Changes that we need to overcome the crisis that we are in now needs to be inclusive. Something that the world also needs at the AU, at the G20, and in other forums. Nkosi Albert Luthuli's presidency also reached out and brought together the different components of the broader Congress alliance, including the ANC, of course, the South African Indian Congress, the South African Congress of Trade Unions, the Colored People's Conference, the South African Congress of Democrats, the South African Communist Party, and the Federation of South African Women. Under the mantle of his leadership, the Freedom Charter was adopted. And just like the Charter, the Beijing Declaration and social contract was also achieved between people. Generation equality also promises to be a social contract and to be inclusion of all of those who are excluded, but also to increase the number of people who are fighting for gender equality. The consolidation of the Congress alliance was a strategic move that set the ANC apart. This enabled the ANC to be the tent of the liberation struggle. And it was during his presidency that the iconic Women's March took place, which drew 20,000 women and gave women a seat in the table. At this time, the role of women within the liberation movement was not a done deal. It could not have been easy to forge ahead with significant inclusion of women at a time when patriarchy was strong in our shores. All we can say is, Malibongwe igama lenkosi u-Albert. I also want to point out that under his leadership, the ANC became a strong part of the international context. The ANC was there in 1955 in the Bandung Conference. The ANC had a relationship with an iconic Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And of course, he won the Nobel Peace Prize and became the first Nobel laureate for South Africa, which validated our struggle. With her active participation in global stage, it meant that the ANC became also truly internationalist. Dear South Africans, we have been led by integrity, compassion, selflessness, and revolutionary morality. This has to strengthen us to stay resolved and resolute. And I thank you, and I salute and bow to this great leader.
Thank you so much, Undersecretary General. And I think I want to ask all the participants to just take a moment to take in that very informative presentation by Dr. Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcuka. And I'm going to also apologize to the museum because Dr. Albertina Luthuli did indicate that she is not very well right now and would rather not be taking part. But I'd really like to ask Dr. Albertina Luthuli to just respond to that presentation. I can see that she is muted at the moment, so I'm going to ask the administrator to please just unmute Dr. Albertina Luthuli to just give a few lines of a response to this presentation.
Thank you.